What if everything you thought you knew about the history of Europe was only half the story? What if, hidden beneath the surface of kings and conquests, lies a secret so profound it could rewrite our understanding of power, lineage, and destiny itself? For centuries, whispers have persisted of a bloodline so ancient, so powerful, that its very existence challenges the foundations of modern history. This isn't just a tale of forgotten royalty, it's a conspiracy that stretches from the shadows of ancient tombs to the inner sanctums of today's most secretive organizations. And at the heart of it all stands one name, the Merovingians. Imagine a dynasty that ruled vast swaths of Europe long before Charlemagne, a line of kings said to possess almost supernatural qualities, long hair believed to hold their power, a legendary origin tied to a sea creature, and a claim of descent that some whisper reaches back to biblical times. These were the Merovingians, and though their official reign ended over 1,000 years ago, the mysteries surrounding them have only grown deeper with time. Their story isn't confined to dusty history books. It lives on in theories that connect them to the Holy Grail, the Knights Templar, and even modern-day secret societies like the Priory of Sion. This is a puzzle that has fascinated historians, treasure hunters, and conspiracy theorists alike, a web of intrigue where ancient myth and documented history blur into one. So why does this matter now? Because this isn't just about the past. It's about the stories we tell ourselves regarding power, legitimacy, and the hidden forces that may still shape our world today. In this video, we're setting out on a journey to uncover the truth behind the Merovingian bloodline conspiracy. We'll explore how a medieval dynasty became the focal point of modern myths, why their legacy sparks such fervent debate, and what it all might mean for our understanding of history's greatest unsolved mysteries. This is a tale of buried secrets, political schemes, and enduring legends, and it's one you won't want to miss. To understand the legend, we must first return to the murky world of the 5th century, a time when the Roman Empire's grip on Western Europe had finally slipped away. Into this power vacuum stepped a multitude of Germanic tribes, among them a group known as the Franks. Their story, and the birth of their most famous dynasty, begins not with a crown in a grand palace, but with a handful of artifacts pulled from the earth centuries later. In 1653, a startling discovery was made in the Belgian town of Tournai, the undisturbed tomb of a Frankish king named Childeric I. This wasn't just any grave, it was a time capsule from the dawn of a new age. Inside, archaeologists found a trove of objects that spoke of a leader straddling two worlds, a Roman-style gold fibula clasping his cloak, a signet ring bearing his image and name, and perhaps most intriguingly, hundreds of tiny golden cicadas and bees. To some, these insects were symbols of immortality and resurrection, early hints of the mystical aura that would later envelop his bloodline. Childeric was a formidable warlord, an ally and a foe to the fading Roman powers, and he laid the crucial groundwork. But it was his son who would truly forge a kingdom from the chaos. That son was Clovis I, a name that would echo through history. When he ascended to power around the year 481, he was just a teenage chieftain ruling a small territory from Tournai. But Clovis possessed a ruthless ambition and a brilliant strategic mind. He embarked on a relentless campaign of military expansion, systematically defeating rival Frankish chieftains, conquering the Roman rump state of Soissons, and vanquishing other Germanic tribes like the Alemanni and the Visigoths. His victory at the Battle of Tolbiac against the Alemanni was a turning point, not just militarily but spiritually. According to the chronicler Gregory of Tours, Clovis, in a moment of desperation during the battle, cried out to the Christian god of his wife Clotilda and vowed to convert if he was granted victory. When the tide of battle turned in his favor, he made good on his promise. This was not merely a personal religious awakening, it was a masterstroke of political genius. By converting to Catholic Christianity instead of the Arian Christianity practiced by most other Germanic rulers, Clovis instantly aligned himself with the powerful Gallo-Roman Catholic population and the influential bishops who governed them. He was baptized in a grand ceremony in Reims, a city that would forever be linked to French kingship, and in that moment he fused raw military might with divine sanction. This fusion of faith and force created the foundations of the Frankish kingdom, a realm that would eventually evolve into the heart of modern France and Germany. Clovis consolidated his rule, established Paris as his capital, and codified Salic law, creating a unified legal system for his diverse peoples. But beyond the politics and the conquests, the Merovingians cultivated a powerful mystique. They were known as the long-haired kings, and their flowing locks were not merely a style choice, they were believed to be the very source of their power and legitimacy. Frankish tradition held that their long hair symbolized a sacred, even supernatural, vitality granted to them by the gods. To cut a Merovingian's hair was to strip him of his right to rule, rendering him impotent and unfit for kingship. This belief in their semi-divine nature was further bolstered by fantastical origin myths. The most famous claimed that the dynasty's founder, Meroving, was born of two fathers, his human father, King Clodio, and a mysterious sea creature, a quinator, that had assaulted his mother on the beach. This supernatural ancestry set them apart, marking them as more than mere mortals. They were a theodens, a sacred kingly line, chosen and set above other men. It is from this potent combination of historical achievement and legendary aura that the deepest conspiracies would later draw their power, weaving fact and folklore into an unbreakable thread of intrigue. For the Merovingians, power was not just a matter of politics or military might. It was woven directly into their very being, a mystical force as tangible as the crowns they wore. Their most defining and visible attribute was their hair, a flowing mane that they refused to ever cut. This wasn't a simple fashion statement or a sign of poor hygiene. It was the bedrock of their legitimacy. Frankish tradition held that their long hair was the physical vessel for their royal mana, a supernatural vitality granted by the gods that made them the only people fit to rule. To shear a Merovingian prince's locks was to literally strip him of his power, rendering him a mere commoner, unfit for the throne. This belief was so potent that when the dynasty was finally overthrown, the usurper's first act was to forcibly tongue the deposed king, cutting his hair and banishing him to a monastery, a symbolic act that proved more powerful than any execution. This aura of the supernatural extended far beyond their hair. Chroniclers of the time attributed to them miraculous healing powers, a divine touch that could cure the sick and wounded. They were said to possess an innate understanding of nature's secrets, an almost druidic connection to the world that set them apart from ordinary men. This otherworldliness was performative as well. Unlike other Germanic kings who would lead their armies on fierce warhorses, the Merovingian monarchs were often transported on great ox carts, a slow, deliberate, and profoundly strange mode of travel for a warrior culture. Picture the scene: a king, his long hair flowing, seated not on a saddle but upon a throne placed in a wagon pulled by plodding oxen, moving through his realm not as a commander but as a living icon, a sacred object to be revered and paraded. This practice created a powerful visual distinction, reinforcing the idea that these were not just leaders of men but something closer to demigods, removed from the mundane struggles of their people and existing on a higher, more mystical plane. These legends were anchored by an origin story so fantastical it defied simple history. The dynasty's namesake, Meroving, was said to be born of two fathers. While his mother was pregnant with the son of King Clodio, she went swimming in the ocean and was allegedly assaulted by a mysterious sea beast known as the quinator. From this encounter, Meroving was born, a hybrid being infused with the otherworldly essence of this aquatic creature. This myth of a dual paternity, both human and monstrously divine, served a crucial purpose. It provided a supernatural explanation for their right to rule, setting their bloodline apart as something chosen, something fundamentally different and more potent than any competing family. They weren't just the most powerful warlords, they were the Theudens, the sacred kingly line, and their authority was believed to be woven into the fabric of the universe itself. It is from this potent blend of documented history and incredible legend that the deepest and most enduring conspiracies would later draw their power, forever blurring the line between the Merovingian kings of fact and the mythic figures of fantasy. Yet for all their mystical aura and formidable beginnings, the power of the Merovingian kings did not last. The very system they built to administer their vast kingdom would ultimately become the instrument of their undoing. As the 7th century wore on, a pattern began to emerge. The kings, once mighty warriors and shrewd politicians, increasingly withdrew from the day-to-day burdens of rule. They were still revered as sacred figures, the long-haired, semi-divine vessels of power, but the gritty work of governing, raising armies, settling disputes, managing estates fell more and more to a trusted official known as the mayor of the palace. Think of this role as the ultimate chief of staff, the king's right hand who handled all the practical matters of state. For generations, these mayors served loyally, but over time, the source of real authority began to subtly shift from the throne room to the mayor's office. The turning point arrived with a period of deep instability. The Frankish realm, following tradition, was often divided among a king's sons, leading to bitter civil wars between rival branches of the Merovingian family. These internal conflicts drained the royal treasury and weakened the prestige of the crown, making the kings more dependent than ever on their chief administrators to hold the kingdom together. It was during this turmoil that one particular family of mayors, later known as the Carolingians, began to amass unprecedented power. Their rise was cemented by a man named Charles Martel Charles the Hammer. Though he was never king, Charles Martel was the undisputed ruler of the Franks in all but name. His legendary victory at the Battle of Tours in 732, where he turned back a formidable Umayyad invasion from Spain, cast him as the savior of Christendom. This monumental achievement was won not by a Merovingian king, but by their mayor, fundamentally transferring the mantle of military and political leadership to the Carolingian house. By the time Charles Martel's son, Pepin the Short, inherited the office of mayor, the situation was utterly farcical. The Merovingian king on the throne, Childeric III, was a complete non-entity, so disconnected from power that later chroniclers would dismissively label him Le Roi Fainéant, the do-nothing king. He reigned, but he did not rule. The entire machinery of the state, the loyalty of the nobles, and the command of the army all answered to Pepin. The question was no longer if the Carolingians would take the throne, but how they could do so without appearing as mere usurpers in the eyes of the people who still believed in the sacred bloodline. Pepin needed a sanction greater than military force. He needed divine approval. So he sent a famous query to the Pope in Rome, asking who truly deserved to be king, the man who held the title or the man who actually did the work of governing. The Pope, who needed a powerful military ally against his enemies in Italy, provided the perfect answer. He declared that it was better for the man with the real power to be king. With this papal blessing, the final act was set in motion. In the year 751, Pepin the Short formally deposed Childeric III. The last Merovingian king's long hair, the sacred source of his power, was shorn. He was tonsured and banished to a monastery, his sacred magic severed along with his locks. Pepin was then anointed and crowned as the new king of the Franks, establishing a new dynasty with the full backing of the church. This moment is often presented as a clean, political transition, but it was far more than that. It was the violent end of an ancient concept of sacred kingship. The throne was now occupied not by a semi-divine being, but by a practical politician anointed by God's representative on earth. The direct rule of the Merovingians was over, but their disappearance from the stage of power only served to ignite the mysteries that would forever swirl around them. For when a bloodline said to be descended from a sea monster vanishes from history, the immediate haunting question is, did it truly end, or did it simply go into hiding, its heirs waiting in the shadows for a chance to reclaim their destined throne? The fall of the Merovingian dynasty was not an ending but a transformation. The moment Pepin the Short seized the throne and the last king's sacred hair was shorn, a powerful new narrative was born, not of an end but of an escape. Almost immediately, whispers began to circulate through the monasteries and courts of Europe. The story went that the true royal bloodline, that sacred Theudens, had not been extinguished but had instead gone underground, preserved through secret marriages and hidden heirs who bided their time, waiting for a moment to reclaim their divine right. This survival theory is the very bedrock upon which the entire modern Merovingian conspiracy is built, and it hinges on two pivotal figures, a murdered king and a prince who may have vanished. The story begins not with the final king, Childeric III, but decades earlier with a much more enigmatic figure, Dagobert II. His reign is a historical ghost story, a brief and tragic flicker in the 7th century. Following the assassination of his father, the young Dagobert was seen as a threat by the powerful mayor of the palace, Ebroin. To neutralize this threat, he was kidnapped, his head shaven to strip him of his royal status, and he was exiled to a monastery in faraway Ireland. For years, he was presumed dead or lost to history, a forgotten prince. But in a dramatic turn of events, he was discovered and restored to his throne in the eastern Frankish kingdom of Austrasia with the help of Wilfrid, the Bishop of York. His return, however, was short-lived. In the year 679, while hunting in the forest of Woven near Stenay, Dagobert II was ambushed and murdered. The official history records it as the act of a disgruntled retainer, but the circumstances were profoundly suspicious. He was killed by a spear thrust through his eye while he slept under a tree, a death that echoes the mythical assassination of the Norse god Balder and feels far more like a ritual killing than a simple act of revenge. This is where history dissolves into mystery. The conspiracy theory proposes that Dagobert's assassination was not the end of his line. It claims he had a young son, Sigebert IV. Fearing the child would be the next target of the plotters who killed his father, a loyal band of knights supposedly smuggled the prince out of danger. According to the legend, this band, which some later theories would romantically link to the foundation of the Knights Templar, whisked the boy away to the safety of the Languedoc region in southern France. There, in the rugged landscape of Rennes-le-Château, he was given a new identity, Sigebert, and was quietly integrated into the local nobility, perhaps into the family of the Counts of Rezes. To ensure his survival and the preservation of the bloodline, his descendants would have married strategically into other noble families over the centuries, their royal heritage a closely guarded secret known only to a select few initiates. This hidden lineage, this waiting king, became known as the Lost King or Le Roi Perdu, a spectral monarch whose very existence promised a future restoration of the sacred order. The survival of Sigebert transforms the Merovingian story from a concluded historical event into an ongoing, hidden saga, a secret history running parallel to the one recorded in textbooks, waiting for the moment it might once again see the light of day. This legend of a hidden bloodline might have remained an obscure footnote for medieval scholars, if not for an astonishing series of events in 20th century France that catapulted it into the center of modern conspiracy culture. The catalyst was a man named Pierre Plantard, and the mechanism was an elaborate, beautiful, and utterly breathtaking historical hoax. In the 1950s and 60s, Plantard and a small group of associates fabricated an entire secret history, complete with meticulously forged ancient documents, and successfully planted them in France's national library, the Bibliothèque Nationale. Their creation was a secret society they named the Priory of Sion, and they claimed it was not a modern invention, but a shadowy order founded in the year 1099 by Godfrey of Bouillon, the legendary Crusader knight who captured Jerusalem. The society's alleged earth-shattering mission to guard the secret of the surviving Merovingian bloodline and one day restore its rightful heirs to power. The proof of this ancient conspiracy arrived in the form of a collection of papers known as the Dossiers Secrets de Henry Lobinot, the secret dossiers of Henry Lobinot. These documents were anonymously deposited at the Bibliothèque Nationale in the 1960s, and they were a masterpiece of pseudo-historical world-building. They contained genealogies tracing a direct line from Dagobert II's supposedly survived son, Sigebert, all the way down to Pierre Plantard himself. But the real genius of the hoax was in its recruitment of famous historical luminaries as alleged Grand Masters of the Priory. The dossiers listed an incredible roster of geniuses who had supposedly led the secret society, including the artist and inventor Leonardo da Vinci, the brilliant scientist Isaac Newton, the iconic writer Victor Hugo, and the composer Claude Debussy. The implication was staggering. It suggested that some of the greatest minds in Western history were not just aware of the secret, but were actively working to protect it, embedding clues about the bloodline and the location of its hidden treasure within their great works of art, science, and literature. This connection to Leonardo da Vinci became the cornerstone of the theory, most famously explored in Dan Brown's novel The Da Vinci Code. The hoaxers pointed to elements in Leonardo's painting The Last Supper, suggesting that the figure to Jesus' right was not the Apostle John but a woman, Mary Magdalene. This, they claimed, was a hidden clue that Jesus and Mary Magdalene were married and had a child, a bloodline that eventually found its way to France and merged with the Merovingians. The Priory of Sion, in this narrative, was the guardian of this dual secret, the survival of a sacred royal bloodline with a claim to the throne of France, and the explosive spiritual truth of a married Jesus, a notion that directly challenged the very foundations of Orthodox Christianity. The documents claimed the Priory's ultimate goal was the establishment of a United States of Europe, a benevolent, mystical theocracy peacefully governed by the restored Merovingian great monarch. For a time, the hoax was incredibly persuasive. The documents looked authentic, the genealogies were complex and detailed, and the idea was irresistibly romantic. It wove together medieval history, hidden treasure, famous names, and a profound religious secret into a single, compelling narrative. It gave the obscure Merovingian mythos a modern engine and a global audience. However, by the 1980s, investigative journalists like the BBC's Henry Lincoln and authors Michael Bagent, Richard Lee, and Henry Lincoln in their book The Holy Blood and the Holy Grail had begun to unravel the truth. They exposed Pierre Plantard as the forger and revealed how he had painstakingly created the entire mythology, even admitting under oath in a court of law that he had fabricated everything. The Priory of Sion was not an ancient knight's order. It was a modern fiction, an elaborate piece of performance art designed to aggrandize its creator. Yet, in a strange twist, the exposure of the hoax did not kill the legend. Instead, it merely added another layer to the mystery. For many, the fact that a modern man went to such incredible lengths to create this story only proved there must be a deeper, hidden truth worth covering up. The Priory of Sion, though debunked, had permanently cemented the Merovingians' place at the heart of a modern conspiracy, transforming them from forgotten kings into the central figures of an alternative history that continues to captivate millions. Yet if the Priory of Sion hoax provided a modern framework for the Merovingian myth, it needed a historical anchor, a real-world location where this secret history could have physically unfolded. That anchor for countless seekers became a tiny, remote village in the foothills of the French Pyrenees named Rennes-le-Château, and the entire mystery revolves around one man, a parish priest named Berenger Saunière. In 1885, Saunière was assigned to the impoverished village, a place so poor his church, dedicated to Mary Magdalene, was literally falling apart. The roof leaked, the windows were broken, and the presbytery was crumbling. Saunier himself was so destitute he had to borrow money from the village mayor just to buy basic supplies. He was, by all accounts, a man of humble means and prospects, destined for a life of quiet obscurity. But then, something extraordinary happened. During a modest renovation of his dilapidated church around 1887, the story goes that Saunier ordered the repair of the main altar. It was supported by an ancient, worn-out Visigoth pillar that some believe was hollow. When workmen moved it, either a small glass phial or a sealed wooden tube fell out and shattered on the floor. Inside, the priest discovered not one, but 4 incredibly fragile parchments. 2 of them were genealogies tracing local noble families, but the other 2 were far more intriguing. They were said to be coded messages expertly penned in Latin, allegedly by the former priest of Rennes-le-Château, Abbé Antoine Bigot, a century earlier. Bigot had been the confessor to the aristocratic Blanche of Hautpoul, the last lady of the manor, and it was rumored that on her deathbed in 1781, she entrusted him with a devastating family secret. The coded parchments were his way of preserving that secret for future generations, hiding it in the one place he felt was safe, inside the very structure of the church itself. Saunier, a reasonably educated man, reportedly spent days trying to crack the codes. One parchment was a simple cipher where the letters were raised slightly above the others. The other was far more complex, a sophisticated rearrangement of letters from a passage in the New Testament. When finally deciphered, the messages were astonishingly cryptic. One read, in part, "This treasure belongs to Dagobert Roman II king and to Sion, and he is there dead." The other declared, "Shepherdess no temptation that Pausin and Teniers hold the key." These phrases were less a clear instruction and more a riddle wrapped in an enigma, pointing to a king, a treasure, and 2 obscure painters from the 17th century. For Saunier, it must have been baffling, but he evidently believed it was a clue to something of immense value hidden in or around his parish. What happened next is the core of the legend. Armed with these cryptic clues, Saunier is said to have embarked on a secretive search of the church and the surrounding countryside. He reportedly found something that changed his life completely. Almost overnight, the penniless priest began to spend money on a staggering, impossible scale. Over the next 2 decades, he poured a fortune into the village. He completely restored the Church of Mary Magdalene in a lavish and wildly eccentric style, adorning it with bizarre, unsettling statues, like a demonic figure crouching beneath the holy water stoop, and inscribing the entrance with the ominous phrase, "This is a terrible place." He built an ornate garden, a massive library tower he called the Tour Magdala, and a luxurious villa with modern comforts like a heated greenhouse. He hosted extravagant parties for important guests from Paris, serving the finest food and wine. Estimates of his total spending in today's money run into many millions of dollars. The central, burning question was, where did a simple country priest with a tiny salary get such vast wealth? The official explanation from the church was that he earned the money from a lucrative side business selling masses. He was, they claimed, essentially paid by pious people across Europe to say prayers for their souls. But the sums involved made this story wholly implausible. The volume of mass requests would have been physically impossible for one man to fulfill. This financial discrepancy led to his eventual falling out with his bishop, who accused him of simony, the selling of sacraments, and removed him from his post. But Saunier never revealed his true source of income, taking his secret to his grave in 1917. It is this profound, unanswered question that has fueled decades of speculation. Did he find a literal treasure, perhaps the lost treasury of the Visigoths, or even the fabled treasure of the Temple of Jerusalem? Or did he find something far more dangerous, proof of the surviving Merovingian bloodline, a secret so explosive that powerful forces, perhaps even the church itself, were willing to pay him a king's ransom for his silence? The legend posits that the parchments didn't lead to gold coins, but to genealogical proof that the heirs of Sigebert were living in the area. This was knowledge that could topple dynasties and challenge the very legitimacy of the French Republic and the Vatican. Saunier's wealth, in this view, was not a reward but hush money, a lifelong pension to ensure the most volatile secret in history remained buried. Yet the true explosion of the Merovingian mystery into a global phenomenon wasn't born from dusty historical documents or a clever hoax. It arrived in the form of a runaway bestseller that became a cultural touchstone. In 2003, author Dan Brown published the Da Vinci Code, a thriller that took the intricate framework built by Pierre Plantard and the Holy Blood and the Holy Grail and transformed it into a breakneck blockbuster narrative. Brown's genius was in his presentation. He didn't present these ideas as fringe theories, but wove them into a modern-day detective story with the compelling hook that all of it was based on factual research. The novel's famous opening page, labeled Fact, boldly stated that descriptions of documents and secret societies were accurate, instantly blurring the line between fiction and history for millions of readers. This single artistic choice granted the Merovingian conspiracy a level of mainstream credibility and attention it had never before achieved. At the heart of Brown's narrative was a theological bombshell that recontextualized the entire Merovingian legend. The book proposed that the true, hidden meaning of the Holy Grail was not the chalice used at the Last Supper, but rather the literal bloodline of Jesus Christ himself. According to this premise, Jesus of Nazareth was not a celibate preacher but a married man whose wife was Mary Magdalene. Furthermore, the story claims she was pregnant with his child at the time of the crucifixion. To escape persecution, she was then smuggled out of Judea and found refuge in the south of France, in the very region that would later become the heart of Merovingian territory. There, her descendants supposedly intermarried with the local Frankish nobility, and this sacred lineage eventually produced the Merovingian kings. This fusion of biblical narrative and European royalty created a potent mythos. The Merovingians weren't just descended from a sea monster, they were the literal, physical heirs to Jesus Christ, making them the ultimate sacred kings on earth. This narrative positioned the Catholic Church as the eternal villain of the piece. Brown's thriller popularized the idea that the Church, in its quest for power in the 4th century, deliberately suppressed the human, married nature of Jesus to deify him and consolidate its all-male priesthood's authority. The existence of a bloodline, a living heir, would have presented a direct threat to the Church's spiritual and political power. Therefore, the conspiracy theory argues, the Church has spent 2 millennia hunting down and exterminating this bloodline and anyone who protected it, from the Albigensian crusade against the Cathars in the Languedoc to the suppression of the Knights Templar. In this framework, the Merovingians were the ultimate target, their downfall not merely a political coup by the Carolingians but a staged event orchestrated or at least sanctioned by a church terrified of a rival claim to spiritual authority based on direct descent. The Priory of Sion, in Brown's telling, became the centuries-long guardian of this explosive secret and the protector of the living descendants, who included, as the book's climax reveals, the story's own heroine, Sophie Neveu. The impact of the Da Vinci Code was seismic. It spent over a year on the New York Times bestseller list, has sold well over 80 million copies, and was adapted into a major Hollywood film directed by Ron Howard and starring Tom Hanks. Almost overnight, themes that were once the domain of esoteric history books and niche conspiracy circles were being discussed in coffee shops, classrooms, and dinner tables around the world. Tourists flocked to the Louvre Museum to see the inverted glass pyramid mentioned in the book's finale. Interest in Rennes le Chateau, Leonardo da Vinci's art, and the Knights Templar skyrocketed. The novel acted as a gateway, introducing a massive global audience to the names Merovingian, Priory of Sion, and the idea of a suppressed bloodline. It made the complex web of theories accessible, exciting, and emotionally engaging by packaging it within a relatable quest for truth against a powerful, shadowy antagonist. Naturally, this explosion of popularity triggered an equally massive backlash from scholars, historians, and Christian theologians. They systematically dismantled the book's core premises, pointing out that there is not a single shred of credible historical evidence for a marriage between Jesus and Mary Magdalene, let alone a child. The Priory of Sion was exposed once and for all as a 20th century fabrication. The intricate codes in Da Vinci's paintings were dismissed as the product of overactive imaginations seeing patterns where none existed. Critics accused Brown of creating a dangerous and misleading concoction that distorted both history and faith for entertainment purposes. Yet, in a fascinating cultural twist, this fervent debunking often served only to fuel public fascination further. For many, the vehement denial from established institutions simply confirmed that there must be a truth worth hiding. The controversy itself became part of the myth, creating a feedback loop where criticism was interpreted as proof of the conspiracy's validity. Dan Brown's novel didn't just tell a story about a secret. It became a modern parable about questioning authority and the allure of hidden knowledge, ensuring that the legend of the Merovingian bloodline would be debated, investigated, and wondered about for years to come. But to truly understand the gravity of this claim, we must journey back to the earliest days of Christianity, to a time when the faith was not a single, unified institution, but a vibrant and often contentious collection of diverse beliefs. The theory of a Jesus bloodline draws much of its symbolic fuel from a branch of early Christianity known as Gnosticism. The Gnostics, whose name comes from the Greek word gnosis, or knowledge, believed that salvation was achieved not through faith or good works alone, but through the acquisition of a secret, esoteric knowledge of the divine. Their texts, many of which were discovered in a jar buried near Nag Hammadi, Egypt, in 1945, present a radically different view of Jesus' teachings and his relationship with Mary Magdalene. In several of these Gnostic Gospels, such as the Gospel of Philip and the Gospel of Mary, Mary Magdalene is portrayed not as a reformed prostitute, a later medieval slanderer, but as the most cherished and enlightened of Jesus' disciples, the one he loved most and to whom he imparted his deepest teachings. The Gospel of Philip even describes her as his koinonos, a Greek word often translated as companion, but which can also imply a partner or spouse, and famously states that Jesus used to kiss her often on the mouth, which the other disciples resented. For Gnostics, this kiss was likely symbolic, representing the transfer of divine knowledge. But for modern bloodline theorists, it is cited as potential evidence of an intimate physical relationship. This portrayal positions Mary not as a minor figure, but as the apostle to the apostles and the rightful heir to Jesus' spiritual legacy, a legacy that could be interpreted as both spiritual and literally genetic. This is where a critical linguistic pun enters the story, one that forms the backbone of the entire bloodline theory. In French, the term for Holy Grail is Saint Graal. However, theorists have long suggested that this term is actually a medieval corruption of an older phrase, sang real, which translates directly to royal blood. This shift from a sacred object to a sacred lineage is the conceptual key that unlocks the entire conspiracy. It proposes that the centuries-long, obsessive quest for the Holy Grail was never about finding a physical chalice. Instead, it was a secret, coded mission to find and protect the living descendants of Jesus and Mary Magdalene, the sang real, or royal bloodline, that had been safeguarded in the south of France. The Merovingian kings, with their legendary supernatural origins and their deep roots in the Frankish nobility of that very region, become the perfect candidates for this sacred lineage. Their supposed descent from the Quinator sea creature is reimagined as a metaphorical cover story for their true, explosive origin, a direct blood connection to the Messiah himself. When scrutinized by historians and biblical scholars, however, this elegant theory begins to unravel. There is no credible historical evidence from the 1st century, either within the canonical New Testament or in reliable external sources, that suggests Jesus was married or had children. The Gnostic texts that venerate Mary Magdalene are not eyewitness accounts. They were written more than a century after the crucifixion and reflect the specific theological debates and mystical ideas of their own time, not necessarily biographical facts about Jesus' life. The linguistic argument around Sangreal and Sangreal is also deeply problematic. The earliest known written version of the Grail legend by the poet Cratien de Troyes in the 12th century refers to it as the Graal, a word meaning a wide, shallow dish. The notion of royal blood is a modern reinterpretation that relies on a later spelling and pronunciation, not the medieval origins of the story. Essentially, the entire theory is built on a series of anachronisms taking much later ideas and symbols and projecting them backward onto the 1st century, then connecting them to a medieval dynasty through a combination of wishful thinking and creative interpretation. Despite its historical frailties, the theory's immense power lies in its narrative appeal. It creates a compelling underdog story, a persecuted sacred bloodline forced into hiding by a powerful, manipulative institution that rewrote history to consolidate its own power. It transforms the Merovingians from obscure, early medieval warlords into the tragic, rightful heirs of a spiritual kingdom, their loss of the throne not a simple political shift but a cosmic injustice. This story resonates because it taps into a deep-seated human fascination with lost royalty, hidden truths, and the idea that history is a lie told by the victors. It's a myth that gives a sense of order and meaning to the random chaos of history, suggesting that a divine plan is secretly unfolding just beneath the surface of recorded events, waiting for the moment of revelation. Whether fact or fiction, the Jesus bloodline theory has irrevocably shaped the modern legend of the Merovingians, elevating them from a footnote in history books to the central figures in one of the world's most enduring and controversial mysteries. This brings us to a dark and pivotal chapter in European history, one that unfolded in the very landscape where Berenger Saunier would later make his mysterious discovery, the Albigensian Crusade. To understand the alleged Merovingian connection, we must first meet the central figures in this tragedy, the Cathars. In the 12th and 13th centuries, the Languedoc region of southern France was a vibrant, independent-minded territory, culturally distinct from the royal power in the north. It was here that Catharism, a dualist Christian heresy, took deep root and flourished. The Cathars, also known as the Albigensians, held beliefs that placed them in direct opposition to the Catholic Church. They saw the material world as the creation of an evil deity, a prison for the soul, and believed that the path to salvation lay through rigorous asceticism and the rejection of all material temptations. They had their own separate church structure with ordained spiritual leaders known as perfecti, who lived lives of extreme poverty and purity. For the conspiracy theory, it is not the Cathars' core theology that matters most, but two specific aspects of their existence. First was their incredible tolerance and the protection they enjoyed from the local nobility. The Counts of Toulouse and other powerful lords in the Languedoc, while not necessarily Cathars themselves, were known for their chivalric culture and their policy of religious tolerance, allowing the Cathar Church to operate openly alongside the Catholic one. This created a safe haven for heterodox ideas. Second, and more crucially, the Cathars utterly rejected the authority and the sacraments of the Roman Catholic Church. They saw the Pope as the representative of the evil creator God and the Church itself as the corrupt whore of Babylon. This made them not just heretics, but a direct threat to the political and spiritual hegemony of the Church in Rome. The theory posits that this tolerant, independent-minded environment in the Languedoc was the perfect place to hide and protect a dangerous secret. If the descendants of Sigebert IV, the lost king of the Merovingians, had indeed been smuggled to this region centuries earlier, they would have found a sympathetic population and a nobility that valued its autonomy from northern French and papal control. The local lords, themselves likely intermarried with this hidden lineage, would have had a vested interest in protecting their royal treasure, not just gold, but a living person with a claim to the throne that could one day be used as a rallying point against their enemies. In this narrative, the Cathar perfecti, as the spiritual and intellectual leaders of the region, became the guardians of this genealogical secret, the true Priory of Sion of their day, preserving the knowledge of the bloodline's survival through oral tradition and perhaps even encoded within their own heterodox teachings. The Church's response to this threat was not just theological, it was apocalyptic. In 1208, after the assassination of a papal legate sent to preach against the heresy, Pope Innocent III declared a crusade not against Muslims in the Holy Land, but against fellow Christians in the heart of Europe. The Albigensian Crusade that followed was one of the most brutal and devastating campaigns of the Middle Ages. For 20 years, northern French barons, led by the notorious Simon de Montfort, descended upon the Languedoc with the promise of absolution and land. The warfare was exceptionally vicious. The siege of the Cathar stronghold of Béziers ended in a horrific massacre where the entire population, estimated at 20,000 men, women, and children, was slaughtered. When the Crusaders asked how to distinguish Catholic from Cathar, the papal legate Arnaud Amaury is famously reported to have said, "Kill them all, God will know his own." From a conventional historical perspective, the Crusades' motives are clear: the utter extermination of a heresy that challenged the Church's very foundation. But the bloodline theory suggests a darker, more calculated motive lurking beneath the surface. What if the heresy was merely the public pretext? What if the true target of this systematic, region-wide annihilation was the possibility of a surviving Merovingian claimant? The Languedoc was the one place in Europe with the will, the independence, and the ideological opposition to Rome to potentially champion such a claimant. By wiping out the entire power structure of the region, the tolerant nobility, the intellectual Cathar perfecti, and even a significant portion of the general population, the Church and its northern French allies were not just crushing a religious minority, they were scorching the earth to ensure that any hidden seed of the old royal bloodline could never again take root and challenge authority. The crusade, in this light, becomes a preventive strike, a genocidal operation to erase not just a belief system, but a bloodline and the knowledge of its existence. The final act of this tragedy, the siege of the mountain fortress of Montségur in 1244, feeds directly into this mystery. After a long siege, the Cathars surrendered. But during a 2-week truce before their execution, something strange happened. Under cover of night, several individuals were said to have been lowered down the sheer cliffs and smuggled out of the besieged castle. What or who was so valuable that it was saved at the 11th hour while hundreds of others willingly walked into the flames? Official history says it was the Cathars' material treasure. The legend whispers it was their real treasure, the last of the perfecti guarding the sacred genealogies, or perhaps even a living descendant of the Roi Perdue themselves, escaping the final purge to keep the bloodline and its secret alive for another day. If the Cathar strongholds were the last known refuge of the secret, and the Albigensian Crusade was the hammer meant to smash it, then the Knights Templar are often cast as the shadowy protectors who may have smuggled that secret to safety. To understand this connection, we must first look at the Templars themselves, an order shrouded in as much mystery as the bloodline they are said to have guarded. Founded in 1118 by a small band of French knights, their official mission was shockingly humble: to protect pilgrims traveling to the Holy Land. Yet within a shockingly short period, perhaps less than a single generation, they transformed from 9 impoverished monks into the world's first multinational banking corporation and one of the most powerful military forces in Christendom. The sheer speed and scale of their ascent has fueled speculation for centuries. How did they amass such incredible wealth and influence so quickly? The traditional answer points to donations from pious nobles and their innovative financial systems. But the conspiracy theory offers a far more tantalizing explanation. They found something under the Temple Mount. During their early years in Jerusalem, the knights were granted headquarters on the Temple Mount, the site of Solomon's temple. Historical records indicate they conducted extensive excavations beneath the stables, though no official logs of their findings were ever kept. The theory suggests that during these digs, they didn't just find gold or jewels. They discovered something of earth-shattering theological and historical significance. Some versions of the legend point to the Ark of the Covenant, the chest said to hold the tablets of the Ten Commandments. Others suggest they found ancient scrolls or genealogical records that detailed the true history of the Merovingian bloodline and its purported descent from Jesus and Mary Magdalene. This knowledge, this truth, became their real treasure and the source of their immense power. It was not just wealth but leverage. The theory posits that the Templars used this discovered knowledge to negotiate their extraordinary privileges from the Pope, essentially gaining autonomy and protection in exchange for their silence. They became the armed guardians of a secret so volatile it could destroy the Church itself. This guardianship role is where the timeline becomes fascinatingly intertwined with other events. The Templar Order was formally founded in 1118. The Albigensian Crusade, aimed at wiping out the Cathars and the Languedoc nobility that may have been protecting the bloodline, began in 1209. The theory suggests this was no coincidence. As the crusading army of Simon de Montfort began its brutal sweep through the south of France, the Templars, with their vast resources and military prowess, are said to have executed a desperate evacuation. Their alleged mission was to extract the most valuable assets from the war zone, not Cathar gold but living individuals, the last known descendants of the Merovingian line, and the physical evidence of their lineage, be it scrolls, relics, or other artifacts. Using their network of preceptories and their fleet of ships, the Templars could have smuggled these people and this knowledge out of southern France to safer locations, perhaps even to Scotland, which was outside the Pope's jurisdiction, ensuring the survival of the bloodline and its secret. This narrative also reinterprets the Templars' infamous end. By 1307, the order was incredibly powerful, but also deeply in debt to King Philip IV of France, a monarch known for his ruthlessness and his financial desperation. Philip, with the collaboration of Pope Clement V, moved against the Templars on Friday, October 13, 1307, arresting hundreds of knights in a coordinated dawn raid. They were charged with heresy, blasphemy, and obscene rituals, including denying Christ and worshipping a mysterious head known as Baphomet. Under brutal torture, many knights confessed to these outlandish crimes, though most later recanted, only to be burned at the stake as relapsed heretics. The official history paints this as a land grab by a bankrupt king. The conspiracy theory, however, suggests the charges were a smokescreen. Philip didn't just want their wealth, he wanted their secret. He may have learned of the bloodline's existence and the Templars' role as its protectors. A living Merovingian descendant with a claim to the throne of France would have been a direct threat to his own Capetian dynasty's legitimacy. His true goal in crushing the Templars was not to seize their money, but to seize their documents, their genealogies, and to eliminate the knights who served as the bloodline's sworn shields. The fact that the Templars' vast treasure was never found only deepens the mystery. Perhaps it was never gold at all, but the knowledge they guarded that was the real prize, successfully hidden away in the chaos of their persecution, waiting for its time to be revealed. This belief in a future return was not a vague hope, but was concretized in a series of medieval prophecies that gripped the popular imagination for centuries. One of the most persistent was the legend of the great monarch, a messianic figure foretold to appear in a time of cataclysmic crisis to save Christendom, unify Europe, and usher in a new golden age of peace and prosperity. While various royal families across Europe were occasionally put forward as potential candidates for this role, a powerful strand of this prophetic tradition specifically pointed to the lost line of the Merovingians as the true source of this future savior king. This wasn't just folklore, it was a potent political idea that influenced the actions of kings and popes. The prophecy suggested that this great monarch would be a descendant of the ancient Frankish kings, a ruler whose legitimacy was not granted by the church but was inherent in his sacred blood, a bloodline that had been unjustly usurped but never truly extinguished. This idea created a constant, low-level anxiety for the later French monarchy. Every time the nation faced a profound crisis, a devastating war, a revolution, a plague, eyes would nervously scan the horizon, wondering if a claimant from the shadows would emerge to fulfill this ancient prediction and challenge the sitting king's right to the throne. These prophecies were often attached to the writings of famous mystics, their ambiguous verses providing a perfect Rorschach test for those seeking signs of the bloodline's return. The most influential of these was the venerated 12th century abbess, Saint Hildegard of Bingen. In her sprawling and mystical works, she described visions of a sun king who would arise from an ancient lineage to restore justice and piety to a corrupt world. While her writings were spiritual and allegorical, they were later interpreted literally by those searching for the great monarch, with the ancient lineage being read as a direct reference to the Merovingians. Even more famously, the 16th century astrologer Nostradamus, in his cryptic quatrains, was believed by many to have hidden references to the return of the lily, a clear symbol of the French monarchy, but specifically one that would be restored to its original, purer form. For believers, these were not mere predictions. They were coded messages confirming that the plan for restoration was still active, guided by the invisible hand of fate and the secret societies that guarded the truth. This prophetic undercurrent helps explain why the mystery of the Merovingians has such enduring power. It transforms their story from a concluded historical event into an unfinished symphony, a narrative waiting for its final movement. The bloodline isn't just a relic of the past, it is a sleeping giant, a dormant claim to power that could, according to the legend, be activated at any moment. This directly fuels modern conspiracy theories, which often posit that our current era of political instability and global turmoil is the exact crisis foretold by the prophecies, the necessary precursor to the great monarch's reveal. It suggests that the secret heirs are not merely historical curiosities but active players waiting in the wings, their supporters working behind the scenes to create the conditions for a grand restoration that will realign global power according to an ancient divine plan. The prophecy provides a compelling framework that makes sense of the ongoing secrecy and the alleged efforts to protect the bloodline. They are not hiding from history, but waiting for history to catch up to their destiny. This transforms every unexplained event or hidden elite gathering into a potential piece of the puzzle, feeding a narrative of hope for some and paranoia for others, but ensuring that the legend of the Merovingian return remains a vibrant and endlessly debated chapter in the story of hidden power. While the grand tapestry of the Merovingian myth is woven with threads from the medieval era, its most vibrant and deceptive colors were added in the mid-20th century by a most unlikely and ingenious figure, Pierre Plantard. A French draftsman with a grandiose imagination and a history of minor fraud, Plantard was not a historian or a nobleman, but a fabulist of unparalleled ambition. His life's work would become the construction of an elaborate fictional universe, one so convincing and richly detailed that it would captivate the world for decades. At the heart of this fabrication was a single, audacious claim that he, Pierre Plantard, was the direct descendant of Dagobert II's son, Sigebert IV, and therefore the true, rightful king of France, the latest inheritor of the sacred Merovingian blood. To give this fantasy the appearance of historical truth, Plantard knew he needed evidence, the kind that would be found not on the internet, but in the hallowed halls of a national institution. In the 1960s, he and a small circle of collaborators, including a man named Philippe de Chérizy, began an intricate project of forgery. Their masterpiece was a collection of documents they titled the Dossiers Secrets de Henri Lobinot, the secret dossiers of Henri Lobinot, a name itself entirely invented. These were not crude fakes, they were meticulously crafted, typed on old paper, and filled with complex genealogical charts, heraldic symbols, and cryptic Latin phrases. In a brazen act, Plantard and his associates secretly deposited these dossiers into the Bibliothèque Nationale de France, the French National Library. By placing his forgeries among the world's most respected historical collections, Plantard granted them an instant and powerful aura of authenticity. Any researcher digging into the mystery would eventually stumble upon these official-looking documents, which laid out a complete and secret history of Europe. The centerpiece of this fabricated history was the Priory of Sion. Plantard's dossiers claimed this was not a modern club, but an ancient knightly order founded in the year 1099 by Godfrey of Bouillon, the Crusader who became the first ruler of Jerusalem. Its purported mission was magnificent: to protect the secret of the surviving Merovingian bloodline and work towards the restoration of its heirs to the thrones of Europe and the establishment of a peaceful, unified United States of Europe. To lend this imaginary order unimaginable credibility, the dossiers included a list of its past Grand Masters, a roll call of Western genius that deliberately defied belief. It included luminaries like Leonardo da Vinci, Isaac Newton, Victor Hugo, and Claude Debussy. The breathtaking implication was that history's greatest minds were not just aware of this secret, they were its active guardians, embedding clues about it in their paintings, scientific laws, and literary works. This clever device made the conspiracy feel ubiquitous, as if the truth had been hidden in plain sight for centuries, waiting for someone clever enough to connect the dots that Plantard himself had just drawn. For a time, the hoax worked perfectly. It was the authors Michael Bagent, Richard Lee, and Henry Lincoln who, in their 1982 book The Holy Blood and the Holy Grail, took Plantard's dossiers at face value and introduced the theory of a Jesus bloodline to a mass audience. Their serious, investigative tone treated the Priory of Sion as a genuine historical entity, and the book became an international bestseller, embedding Plantard's ideas deep into popular culture. The illusion, however, could not last forever. Investigative journalists and skeptical historians began to pick apart the story. They found that the oldest document ever referring to the Priory of Sion was a simple registration paper from 1956, listing Pierre Plantard as its president. The genealogies were exposed as fantastical constructions, weaving together unrelated noble families with blatant inaccuracies. The final blow came during a 1993 court case in France. Plantard was called to testify under oath regarding his involvement with the Priory. Faced with perjury charges, he was forced to admit the whole magnificent edifice was a fabrication, an elaborate work of fiction he had created to aggrandize himself and promote his own political ideals. Yet, in a strange twist that speaks to the power of a good story, the exposure of the fraud did not kill the legend Pierre Plantard had birthed. For many, his confession under legal duress only made him seem more like a man forced to silence by the very powers his conspiracy threatened. The idea that he would go to such incredible, elaborate lengths forging documents, planting them in a national library, and maintaining the lie for decades led some to believe he must have been acting on behalf of a deeper, even more secret truth. The hoax itself became just another layer of the mystery, proof that the real secret was so powerful it required an elaborate smokescreen. While the Priory of Sion was conclusively revealed as a 20th century confidence trick, the fascination with the underlying Merovingian bloodline conspiracy had already taken on a life of its own, proving that a compelling narrative, once set loose into the world, can be far more durable than historical fact. Yet for all its intricate storytelling and compelling narrative, the Merovingian bloodline conspiracy crumbles under the cold, hard light of historical scrutiny. Professional historians and academic scholars have dissected its claims for decades, and their consensus is nearly unanimous. This is not a hidden history, but a modern mythology woven from wishful thinking, creative misinterpretation, and outright forgery. The entire edifice is built upon a foundation of anachronisms, ideas, and symbols from one time period being incorrectly projected onto another. For instance, the very concept of the Priory of Sion as a secret society guarding a bloodline relies on a 19th century romantic notion of such organizations, not the reality of how medieval monastic orders or knightly brotherhoods actually operated. These groups were deeply embedded in the social and religious fabric of their time, not lurking in the shadows plotting to install a secret king centuries later. The famous list of Grand Masters featuring Leonardo da Vinci and Isaac Newton is a perfect example of this chronological fallacy, plucking famous figures from across the centuries and inserting them into a fictional lineage for dramatic effect, with no regard for the actual historical context of their lives and work. The most devastating blow to the theory is the complete and total lack of any credible contemporary evidence for the survival of the Merovingian bloodline past the 8th century. The story of Dagobert II's son, Sigebert IV, being smuggled to safety is a historical ghost. No chronicle, charter, letter, or legal document from the 7th or 8th centuries, the time when these events were supposed to have occurred, so much as mentions his existence, let alone his dramatic escape. In an era when royal lineages were meticulously documented by monks and chroniclers for legal and dynastic purposes, the sudden appearance and disappearance of a royal prince would not have gone unnoticed. The first mention of this survival narrative appears not in a medieval manuscript but centuries later, in texts that are themselves of dubious origin and filled with legendary material. From a historian's perspective, this is a critical red flag. A claim that only appears hundreds of years after the alleged event is considered hearsay, not evidence, and is treated with extreme skepticism. The linguistic heart of the Jesus bloodline theory, the play on words between Sangreal, Holy Grail, and Sangreal, Royal Blood, has also been thoroughly dismantled by linguists. The earliest Grail romances, written by Chrétien de Troyes in the 12th century, use the old French word grol or grille, which simply refers to a wide, platter-like dish. The spelling and pronunciation that would allow for the Sangreal pun is a much later development, making it impossible for medieval knights to be on a quest for a bloodline based on this particular play on words. This crucial pillar of the theory is not a medieval clue but a modern, back-formed interpretation, a classic case of seeing a pattern that wasn't originally there. Perhaps the most definitive evidence against the conspiracy is the proven hoax at its core. The dossier's secrets, the very documents that launched the modern Priory of Sion myth, were conclusively exposed as forgeries created by Pierre Plantard and his associates in the 1960s. Plantard himself admitted under oath in a French court that he had fabricated the entire story, the genealogies, and the existence of the ancient secret society to aggrandize himself and promote his own political ideas. This isn't a matter of scholarly debate, it is a legal and documented fact. While believers might argue that his confession was coerced or part of an even deeper deception, historians rightly point to Occam's razor. The simplest explanation is usually the correct one. An elaborate, proven 20th century hoax is a far more plausible source for the story than a 1,000-year-old conspiracy that left no trace in the historical record until a known fraudster decided to write it down. Ultimately, historians view the Merovingian bloodline conspiracy not as malicious fiction, but as a fascinating example of what they term public history or historical mythology. It is a story that fulfills a deep human desire for romance, mystery, and a sense that our familiar world is not what it seems. It provides a grand, unifying narrative that connects disparate historical dots, the Cathars, the Templars, Renaissance artists, into a satisfyingly secret pattern. But this pattern is one we impose from the present, not one we discover from the past. The real history of the Merovingians, the Cathars, and the Knights Templar is complex, messy, and compelling enough on its own terms, driven by the tangible forces of politics, economics, and religion, not by the protection of a hidden bloodline. The conspiracy theory, for all its allure, tells us less about the medieval world and more about our own modern longing for meaning, our skepticism of authority, and our enduring fascination with the idea that the truth is always hidden, waiting just beneath the surface for the right person to uncover it. To truly grasp why the idea of a hidden Merovingian bloodline holds such power, we must step into the mindset of medieval Europe, a world where blood was not merely a biological fact but the very currency of power, legitimacy, and divine order. In our modern era, a leader's right to rule is typically grounded in concepts like democratic election, legal appointment, or even military force. But in the medieval world, legitimacy flowed directly through veins. A king's authority was not considered a social contract but a sacred inheritance, a divine right passed down through a unique and unbroken bloodline. This was a society built on a rigid, God-ordained hierarchy, and the royal family sat at its apex, believed to be chosen by God himself to lead. To disrupt this lineage was to upset the natural and celestial order, potentially inviting divine wrath, civil war, and chaos upon the entire kingdom. This profound cultural belief transforms the Merovingian survival theory from a simple historical "what if" into a narrative of cosmic significance, explaining why such an idea could feel so compellingly real. This concept of royal blood was far more than a metaphor. It was thought to contain tangible, almost magical properties. This belief stemmed from ancient Germanic traditions, where certain families were seen as being descended from the gods, literally imbued with a supernatural vitality or mana that made them uniquely suited to rule. The Merovingians themselves were the quintessential example, with their long, uncut hair believed to be the physical reservoir of this sacred power, but this idea persisted long after their fall. There was a widespread belief across Europe that kings possessed the royal touch, the miraculous ability to heal diseases like scrofula, known as the king's evil, simply by laying their hands upon the afflicted. This wasn't seen as a learned skill but as an innate magical power inherent in their blood. A king anointed with holy oil during his coronation was transformed into a Christus, a Christ-like figure, his very body becoming a sacred vessel. His blood was, in a sense, different from that of his subjects closer to the divine, charged with a responsibility and a power that was both a blessing and a burden. This system created an intense, all-consuming obsession with genealogy. The proof of a pure and direct bloodline was everything. A claim to a throne required meticulously documented descent from a previous legitimate ruler. This is why royal courts employed historians and monks to carefully chronicle family trees, and why a single disputed marriage or a rumor of illegitimacy could spark generations of conflict, like the dynastic wars that ravaged England for decades. A claimant with a weak bloodline claim was vulnerable, while a rival with a stronger, purer genealogical argument could muster immense support, even if they had no army. In this context, the physical elimination of a rival royal family was not just a political tactic. It was considered a necessary act to extinguish the divine spark that could ignite a challenge. The Carolingians' act of tonsuring the last Merovingian king and locking him away in a monastery makes perfect sense in this light. They weren't just removing a man, they were attempting to snuff out the sacred flame of his bloodline, publicly demonstrating that its power had been broken and transferred to their new church-anointed dynasty. It is within this cultural framework that the legend of the Merovingian survival becomes so potent and plausible. If a society genuinely believes that a drop of royal blood contains a divine right to rule, then the complete eradication of that bloodline becomes the only way to ensure security for the new regime. The fact that the Carolingians and the Church so publicly ended the Merovingian reign would have ironically fed the rumors that they had not been entirely successful. In a world steeped in miracle stories, relics, and divine intervention, the idea that a loyal band of knights could have smuggled away an infant prince to preserve the sacred bloodline fits a familiar and satisfying pattern. It transforms a political overthrow into a spiritual struggle between a usurping power and a hidden, sacred truth. The lost king, the Roi Perdu, becomes more than a man. He becomes a symbol of a lost golden age and a hope for its restoration. A sleeping sovereign whose very existence, even if unknown, holds a mirror to the perceived illegitimacy of every subsequent ruler. The medieval mind was perfectly prepared to believe in such a secret because it was a world where the mystical and the political were forever intertwined. Yet if the Priory of Sion was a modern invention, the allure of secret societies guarding ancient truths is a tale as old as time, and the Merovingian legend found fertile ground in the rituals and folklore of much older, very real organizations. Among the most frequently cited are the Rosicrucians, a mysterious fraternity that first emerged in early 17th century Europe through a series of anonymous manifestos. These documents told of a legendary founder, Christian Rosencreutz, who had supposedly traveled to the East and returned with esoteric wisdom that he encoded into a secret society. The Rosicrucian manifestos spoke of a coming age of enlightenment and the reformation of the entire world, ideas that resonated deeply with those who believed in a hidden order guiding humanity's fate. While the Rosicrucians never explicitly mentioned the Merovingians, their core narrative of a secret brotherhood preserving a transformative truth for a future reckoning provided a perfect template. Later theorists would draw a direct line, suggesting that the hidden truth the Rosicrucians guarded was the knowledge of the sacred bloodline, and that their calls for a new age were veiled prophecies of the great monarch's return. The Rosicrucian emphasis on alchemy, the transformation of base metal into gold, was reinterpreted as a metaphor for the eventual transformation of a hidden heir into a glorious king, restoring a spiritual golden age to Europe. This idea of a hidden guiding hand finds its most powerful expression in Freemasonry, a fraternal order whose complex symbolism and layered degrees have made it a perpetual focus for conspiracy theories. Unlike the possibly mythical early Rosicrucians, Freemasonry is a very real organization with a documented history stretching back to the late 16th and early 17th centuries. It grew from the guilds of actual stonemasons into a speculative society where men used the tools and symbols of the builders craft the square, the compass, the plumb line, as metaphors for moral and intellectual self-improvement. Within its higher degrees, particularly in the Scottish Rite and York Rite branches, are stories and symbols that bloodline theorists have eagerly adopted into the Merovingian narrative. The most prominent is the story of Hiram Abiff, the legendary master architect of Solomon's Temple, who was murdered by 3 ruffians for refusing to divulge the secret passwords of a master mason. This tale of a murdered master and lost secrets is seen by some as a symbolic retelling of the assassination of Dagobert II and the loss of the Merovingian lineage, with the Masonic quest to recover the lost word representing the eternal search for the lost king. Furthermore, the geographic and thematic overlaps are tantalizing for conspiracy hunters. Freemasonry's origin myths are deeply tied to the Knights Templar, with a persistent legend that after their suppression in 1307, surviving Templars fled to Scotland and preserved their secrets within the early Masonic lodges. This alleged Templar Masonic connection creates a hypothetical pipeline. If the Templars were the protectors of the Merovingian bloodline and their secret, and if the Freemasons are the spiritual or literal heirs of the Templars, then the secret of the bloodline could have been embedded within the allegorical plays and symbolic degrees of Freemasonry. This is why so much attention is paid to the imagery within Masonic lodges and documents. The use of the bee symbol, for instance, which was found in the tomb of the Merovingian king Childeric, also appears in Masonic iconography. To a believer, this is not a coincidence but a silent nod to a shared, hidden heritage, a symbol passed down through centuries to identify those who know the truth. The allure of this connection was powerfully demonstrated in the 18th century with the rise of a particular strain of Freemasonry known as the Strict Observance, led by a German nobleman named Baron von Hund. He claimed to have been initiated by unknown superiors who revealed to him that Freemasonry was actually the direct continuation of the Knights Templar order. This idea of a hidden leadership guiding the society from the shadows captured the imagination of European aristocracy and perfectly mirrors the later claims of the Priory of Sion. These kinds of elite, chivalric Masonic orders became obsessed with the idea of restoring a lost, legitimate royalty to the world, a concept that seamlessly aligns with the prophecy of the Merovingian great monarch. While mainstream Freemasonry has consistently denied any political agenda or possession of a secret royal bloodline, the persistence of these myths within its more obscure branches provided a ready-made architecture of mystery that Pierre Plantard and others would later exploit to give their modern hoax an air of ancient legitimacy. Ultimately, the relationship between these secret societies and the Merovingian myth is less one of factual guardianship and more one of symbolic resonance. These organizations, particularly Freemasonry, are built on the use of allegory and symbol to convey lessons about morality, philosophy, and the search for truth. The story of a lost, sacred bloodline is a powerful allegory in its own right, a story about the loss of innocence, the corruption of power, and the hope for restoration. It was perhaps inevitable that these two streams of thought would converge. The societies did not necessarily create the bloodline myth, but their existence provided a plausible and exciting vessel for it to travel through time, their rituals offering a language and a structure that allowed a fringe theory about medieval kings to evolve into a full-blown alternative history of the Western world. This potent blend of sacred lineage and secret societies does not exist in a historical vacuum. It spills over into the modern world with startling and sometimes dangerous consequences. The idea of a lost Merovingian king waiting to be restored has been eagerly adopted by a spectrum of political movements, each molding the myth to fit their own vision for the future. In France, certain monarchist circles, particularly those disillusioned with the modern republic, look to the legend not just as a fascinating story, but as a potential political program. For them, the Merovingians represent a purer, more authentically French form of kingship that predates the later Carolingian and Capetian dynasties, a rule based on sacred right rather than church-sanctioned power grabs. They see the restoration of this ancient bloodline, should a legitimate heir ever be identified, as a way to transcend the fractiousness of modern partisan politics and reunite the nation under a figure of timeless, mystical legitimacy. This is not merely a nostalgic fantasy, it is a deeply ideological stance that views democracy as a corrupt and unstable aberration compared to the divinely ordained order of a sacred monarchy. The appeal of this narrative extends far beyond the borders of France and the confines of monarchism, finding a particularly receptive home within certain strands of European nationalism and the far right. These movements often co-opt the symbolism of the Merovingian bloodline, weaving it into a larger tapestry of ethno-nationalist mythology. In this distorted reading, the purity of the sacred bloodline becomes conflated with poisonous ideas of racial purity. The theory is used to support a claim that a particular European people or a specific noble class are the true heirs to a lost, superior civilization, one that must be defended against modern threats like globalization, immigration, and cultural dilution. The call for a great monarch to emerge from hiding and restore order is repurposed into a call for a strong, authoritarian leader who will purify the nation and lead a revival based on this idealized mythical past. The Merovingian myth in this context ceases to be a historical mystery and becomes a weaponized symbol in the culture wars, a proof of concept for the idea that current borders and governments are illegitimate and must be swept away by a revolution that is also a restoration. The danger of this mythological thinking in contemporary politics cannot be overstated. When complex modern socio-economic issues are reduced to simplistic narratives about hidden bloodlines and ancient conspiracies, it short-circuits rational debate and factual analysis. It creates a world view where evidence and reason are subordinate to a compelling story, one that offers the emotionally satisfying clarity of a battle between pure good and absolute evil. This can make followers susceptible to demagoguery, as a leader can position themselves as the one who understands the true history and promises to act on it. Furthermore, by framing political struggle in terms of a centuries-old spiritual war, it can legitimize extreme actions. If one believes they are fighting to restore a divine order that was usurped over 1,000 years ago, then modern political compromises and legal norms can seem insignificant, even cowardly. The myth provides a grand, historical justification for radicalism, painting its adherents not as extremists but as brave guardians of a long-lost truth finally on the verge of victory. This illustrates the enduring and dark power of the Merovingian legend. It is a story so adaptable, so rich in symbolism, that it can be harnessed for everything from whimsical adventure novels to deeply serious political agendas that seek to reshape the modern world. The bloodline theory acts as a blank canvas onto which different groups can project their deepest fears and their most fervent hopes. It demonstrates that history is never truly past. The stories we tell about where we came from directly influence our beliefs about where we should be going. A tale that began with the long-haired kings of the Dark Ages continues to shape ideologies and inspire movements in the 21st century, proving that the most powerful legacy of the Merovingians may not be the kingdoms they built, but the endless and often unsettling possibilities of the myth they left behind. The hunt for tangible proof of these grand legends inevitably leads us out of the archives and into the earth itself, where archaeologists and treasure hunters have wielded shovels and ground-penetrating radar in a decades-long quest for evidence. The epicenter of this physical search has always been the enigmatic village of Rennes-le-Château, where the story of Bérenger Saunier's sudden wealth ignited a modern gold rush. Almost immediately after the priest's death, locals and later outsiders began scouring the landscape, convinced that his millions were buried somewhere in the hills. This initial haphazard digging gave way to more organized, though often equally speculative, expeditions in the latter half of the 20th century. Teams, sometimes funded by wealthy enthusiasts, conducted extensive excavations around the church, the cemetery, and the surrounding countryside, searching for hidden chambers, underground tunnels, or the fabled treasure of the Visigoths. They found plenty of anomalous cavities in the bedrock, ancient foundations, and man-made tunnels of uncertain origin, but no chests of gold or silver. The most tantalizing finds were often symbolic. A stone slab known as the Dalle de Chevaliers, the Knight Slab, discovered in the late 19th century and depicting a scene that some interpreted as a mounted knight, and various cryptic inscriptions on tombstones in the churchyard. However, these artifacts were open to wide interpretation and provided no definitive link to a hidden bloodline, serving more as Rorschach tests for believers than as concrete evidence. Beyond the treasure hunt, a more scholarly form of archaeological investigation has focused on the Merovingians themselves through the excavation of their magnificent burial sites. The discovery of King Childeric's tomb in Tournai in 1653 remains the single most important archaeological find related to the dynasty, a stunning window into their wealth and their fusion of Roman and Germanic culture. Modern archaeology has continued this work, unearthing thousands of Merovingian-era graves across France, Germany, and Belgium. These burials paint a vivid picture of a warrior aristocracy obsessed with displaying status in death. The graves of both men and women are filled with an array of grave goods, fierce Francisca throwing axes and Scramasacs long knives for the men, intricate fibulae brooches and strings of glass and amber beads for the women. They reveal a society with extensive trade networks, receiving goods from as far away as the Middle East and India. Yet, for all their splendor, these graves are resolutely pagan or secular in nature. They show no signs of the unique Christian symbology or hidden messages that would be expected if this dynasty was the guardian of a profound Christian secret. The archaeology confirms their historical power and wealth, but offers no support for the more fantastical claims of a Jesus bloodline. In fact, the material culture suggests a people who are only beginning their conversion to Christianity, not the heirs to its deepest mystery. The most scientific avenue of inquiry has emerged in the 21st century with the advent of modern genetics. The theory of a surviving bloodline is at its core a question of genealogy, and DNA analysis presents a tantalizing tool for testing it. The ideal scenario would be to locate the undisputed remains of a Merovingian king, such as Dagobert II, extract a DNA sample, and then compare it to potential living descendants. However, this is fraught with immense difficulty. The remains of the Merovingian monarchs are scattered, lost, or destroyed. Dagobert II was originally interred at the Basilica of Saint-Remy in Stenay, but his tomb was desecrated during the French Revolution and his bones were lost. Other royal burials have suffered similar fates. Even if a viable sample were obtained, establishing a continuous paternal lineage over 13 centuries is a near impossible task, as the Y chromosome lineage can be broken by adoption, illegitimacy, or simply a lack of male heirs. Some researchers and amateur genealogists have attempted to construct family trees linking modern individuals back to the Merovingians, but these efforts rely on the same questionable medieval chronicles and forged documents that started the mystery, not on verifiable genetic data. Despite these challenges, genetic studies have inadvertently shed light on the broader population dynamics of early medieval Europe, providing context that indirectly informs the conspiracy. Studies of modern European DNA, particularly on the Y chromosome, have identified major haplogroups that spread with the migrations of Germanic tribes like the Franks. This confirms the significant genetic impact these groups had on the population, but it does not point to a single, unique royal genetic signature. The Merovingians, from a genetic standpoint, were likely part of a broader Frankish aristocratic elite. Their distinctiveness was a cultural and political construction, reinforced by legend and ritual like the growing of long hair, not necessarily a matter of unique biology. The quest for a Merovingian DNA signature is, in a way, a modern scientific echo of the medieval belief in special royal blood, but science has so far found no evidence to support it. The silence of the bones and the absence of a genetic smoking gun speak volumes, suggesting that while the Merovingians were very real kings, the conspiracy of their survival is a narrative built on sand, not buried in it. The earth has yielded their history, but not their secret, because the secret, it seems, was never there to be found. While the seeds of the Merovingian mystery were planted in medieval soil, it was the power of the printed word that allowed them to grow into a sprawling, global phenomenon. The conspiracy as we know it today is not the product of a single moment, but a literary tapestry woven over 2 centuries, with each author pulling new threads from history, folklore, and their own imagination to add depth and complexity to the legend. This evolution began not with a grand historical thesis, but with the romantic local folklore of the French countryside. Throughout the 19th century, whispers and tales circulated in the Languedoc region, particularly around Rennes-le-Château, speaking of a hidden treasure buried by either the Visigoths or the Cathars. These were largely oral traditions, fireside stories passed down through generations of local farmers until a pivotal figure decided to commit them to paper. The first major literary stepping stone appeared in 1884 with the publication of a novel by a local author and antiquarian named Antoine Captier. Titled Le Trésor de Rennes, or The Treasure of Rennes, this book was a work of fiction, but it was deeply rooted in the area's popular legends. Captier's story wove together tales of a hidden fortune, a mysterious parchment, and the tragic history of the Cathars, effectively codifying the oral tradition and giving it a tangible form. Though it remained a regional curiosity, its importance cannot be overstated. It provided the foundational narrative that would later be picked up and amplified. It created a template of a secret hidden in the landscape, waiting for a clever seeker to decipher its clues, a template that would prove irresistible to future researchers. The story might have remained a regional oddity if not for a series of popular history books published in the mid-20th century that began to connect these local French mysteries to broader, more sensational themes. In 1956, author Robert Charroux published Trésors du Monde, or Treasures of the World, which compiled global legends of lost riches and dedicated a chapter to the mystery of Rennes-le-Château. Charroux's work introduced the puzzle of Bérenger Saunier's wealth to a wider French audience, framing it as an unsolved enigma. This was followed in 1960 by a book that would become a cornerstone for all subsequent theories, L'Or de Rennes, or The Gold of Rennes by Gérard de Cide, written in collaboration with none other than Pierre Plantard. This book presented Saunier's story as fact, complete with the tantalizing details of the coded parchments and the priest's extravagant spending. De Cide's book was a masterful blend of fact and fiction, presented with a journalist's flair for mystery, and it acted as a lightning rod, attracting the attention of curious minds across Europe who were eager to solve the puzzle themselves. This set the stage for the single most important work in the conspiracy's evolution before the Da Vinci Code, the 1982 book The Holy Blood and the Holy Grail by Michael Bagent, Richard Lee, and Henry Lincoln. Lincoln, a British television documentary maker, had been fascinated by De Cide's book and had already produced several BBC films on the topic. Teaming up with authors Bagent and Lee, they embarked on a years-long investigation that sought to uncover the truth behind the surface-level treasure hunt. Their book was a monumental achievement in speculative non-fiction. They took Plantard's Priory of Sion hoax at face value, treating the dossier's secrets as genuine historical documents, and used them as a roadmap to construct a breathtaking new hypothesis. They were the first to synthesize the local treasure legend, the story of the Priory of Sion, the history of the Merovingians, and the Gnostic Gospels into a single, unified theory, that the true secret was not gold but a bloodline, the literal descendants of Jesus Christ protected for centuries by a secret society. The Holy Blood and the Holy Grail became an international bestseller, shocking readers with its audacious claims and its sober, investigative tone. It presented its conclusions not as wild speculation but as the logical outcome of serious research, which made its impact all the more profound. The book transformed the Merovingian conspiracy from an obscure French historical curiosity into a full-blown alternative history of the Western world, appealing to a growing cultural appetite for questioning established institutions and exploring esoteric spirituality. It provided a seemingly coherent narrative that connected dots across 2 millennia, offering a secret history that was far more compelling to many than the standard academic account. The book's success created a whole new genre of historical conspiracy writing and established the core framework that all subsequent works, including Dan Brown's, would directly draw upon. The baton was then passed to fiction, where the story found its most explosive and widespread audience. Dan Brown's 2003 novel, The Da Vinci Code, did not invent the theory, it novelized it. Brown's genius was in his packaging. He took the dense, complex research of the Holy Blood and the Holy Grail and embedded it within a fast-paced, modern-day thriller. His protagonist, Robert Langdon, was a relatable everyman academic thrust into a world of deadly secret societies and centuries-old cover-ups. By stating on his famous fact page that the Priory of Sion, its documents, and its rituals were real, Brown blurred the line between fiction and reality for millions of readers who had never encountered the theory before. He stripped the academic pretense away and focused on the narrative engine, a chase for the truth against a powerful, shadowy antagonist, which in this case was the church itself. The novel became a cultural tsunami, selling tens of millions of copies and spawning a blockbuster film, ensuring that the ideas of a Jesus bloodline and a Merovingian survival were discussed in living rooms and classrooms around the globe. The literary evolution of the conspiracy did not end with Brown. It simply fractalized. The immense commercial success of the Da Vinci Code triggered a massive publishing boom, with shelves filling up with both supportive and critical texts. Dozens of authors published books claiming to have found the real secret of Rennes-le-Chateau or to have uncovered new evidence for the bloodline. This included works that pushed the theory into even more speculative territory, linking it to extraterrestrials, advanced ancient civilizations, and other paranormal phenomena. Simultaneously, there was an equally vigorous backlash. Books like The Da Vinci Hoax by Carl E. Olson and Sandra Meisel and Breaking the Da Vinci Code by Darrell Bock were published specifically to debunk the historical claims point by point. This created a vibrant, often heated dialogue in the literary world, which only served to keep the mystery in the public eye. The story's journey from a regional French folktale to an international best-selling thriller perfectly mirrors our own cultural journey over the last century. A growing distrust of authority, a hunger for spiritual meaning outside traditional structures, and an enduring fascination with the idea that history is not what it seems, and that the greatest story ever told might still be waiting uncovered. To understand why the Catholic Church is cast as the ultimate villain in this grand narrative, we must first step back and examine the unique and often fraught relationship between the throne of France and the throne of St. Peter. For centuries, the French monarchy and the papacy were locked in a delicate dance of mutual dependence and fierce competition. The Church provided the spiritual sanction that made a king's rule legitimate in the eyes of God and his people. In return, the king offered military protection and earthly power to enforce church doctrine. This was the theory of the two swords. The Pope wielded the spiritual sword, and the Emperor wielded the temporal one, both ordained by God to work in harmony. But in practice, this was a constant power struggle. The French crown, even after the Merovingians, fiercely guarded what it called the Gallican liberties, a set of principles that asserted the special independence of the French Church from direct papal control. Kings believed they had the right to appoint bishops and manage church property within their own realm, a claim that frequently brought them into direct conflict with a pope in Rome who insisted on universal authority. This historical tension created a fertile ground for conspiracy theories to take root. The idea that the church might have schemed to remove a dynasty that was too independent, too Gallican, or perhaps possessed a form of spiritual authority that rivaled its own, fits perfectly into this long-standing narrative of papal overreach and royal resistance. When we look specifically at the fall of the Merovingians, the church's role becomes a critical point of contention. The official story, as chronicled by writers sympathetic to the new Carolingian dynasty, is one of smooth transition and divine approval. Pope Zachary, when asked by Pepin the Short whether it was right for the man with the real power to hold the title of king, gave his famous blessing. This papal sanction was then physically enacted when Saint Boniface anointed Pepin as king in a solemn ceremony, transferring God's grace from the old, sacred bloodline to the new, pragmatic ruler. From this perspective, the church wasn't the instigator of a conspiracy, but a facilitator of a necessary political change. recognizing the reality of power and ensuring a stable transition that served the greater good of the Frankish people and Christendom. The Merovingians had become ineffective, and the Carolingian mayors were the ones truly defending the realm and the faith, as Charles Martel's victory at Tours had proven. The Church, in this view, simply acknowledged a fait accompli and blessed it, providing continuity and order. However, the conspiracy theory flips this narrative completely on its head. It posits that the Church wasn't a passive endorser but an active, scheming participant in a calculated coup. Why would the Vatican want to remove the Merovingians? The theory suggests several compelling reasons rooted in raw power. The Merovingians, with their long hair and mythical descent from a sea creature, derived their legitimacy from a primal, pre-Christian concept of sacred kingship. Their power came from their blood, not from a papal coronation. This made them dangerously independent. A king who believes he is semi-divine by birth has little need to bow to the authority of a bishop in Rome. The Carolingians, by contrast, were entirely the Church's creation. Pepin's power and legitimacy flowed directly from the holy oil poured by Saint Boniface. His dynasty owed its very existence to the Pope's approval, creating a relationship of deep dependency and obligation. By engineering the switch, the Church traded a dynasty it couldn't control for one it absolutely could, securing a powerful and loyal earthly enforcer for centuries to come. This reinterpretation transforms the papal blessing from a benign act of recognition into the central act of a spiritual usurpation, where the Church seized the right to make and unmake kings for its own benefit. This alleged motive connects to an even deeper and more provocative layer of the theory, the suppression of spiritual truths. The conspiracy doesn't just claim the Church wanted a more obedient king. It suggests the Merovingians were deposed because they were the guardians of a heterodox Christian tradition that posed an existential threat to Vatican orthodoxy. This is where the legend of the Jesus bloodline becomes crucial. If the Merovingians were indeed the descendants of Jesus and Mary Magdalene, their very existence embodied a living challenge to the core doctrines the Church had established centuries earlier. A married Jesus with children fundamentally undermines the concept of a celibate priesthood and the unique divinity of Christ as the sole Son of God. It suggests that grace and salvation could be passed down through a physical bloodline, a concept known as immanence, where the divine is present within the material world rather than solely through the sacraments administered by the Church. This idea of immanence was the absolute opposite of the Church's doctrine of transcendence, which emphasized God's separation from the sinful material world and the necessity of the Church as the sole intermediary. The Merovingians, in this light, weren't just political rivals, they were walking, talking heresy. Their removal was therefore not a simple political calculation but a theological necessity, a required step to protect the very foundation of the institutional Church's power and its monopoly on salvation. This narrative of a corrupt institution suppressing a purer, older truth is an incredibly powerful and enduring archetype. It taps into a deep well of cultural suspicion toward large, powerful organizations, particularly those that claim a monopoly on truth. The Catholic Church, with its long and complex history involving inquisitions, crusades, and internal scandals, is a perfect vessel for this kind of suspicion. The Merovingian conspiracy theory brilliantly merges this general distrust with a specific, romantic alternative, a lost form of Christianity that was more personal, more mystical, and perhaps more authentic, embodied by a sacred king and his lineage. It frames the entire history of medieval Europe not as the triumph of a unified Christendom, but as a relentless, shadowy war by a bureaucratic institution to exterminate its rivals and control the narrative. Whether one believes the theory or not, its potency lies in how effectively it uses the real historical tensions between Paris and Rome, and the Church's documented actions against other heresies like the Cathars, to construct a compelling and emotionally resonant story of a glorious truth lost to time. buried not by accident but by design. Perhaps what makes the Merovingian story feel so strangely familiar is that it is not unique. It is simply a particularly potent iteration of one of humanity's oldest and most enduring story templates. Across continents and centuries, cultures have whispered of a lost king or a hidden heir, a figure of destined power waiting in the shadows for the right moment to return and restore a stolen golden age. This motif, known as the Rex Quondam, Rex Futuris, the once and future king, taps into a profound and universal psychological need, giving shape to our deepest anxieties about disorder and our most fervent hopes for redemption. Consider the most famous Western example, the legend of King Arthur. The bedrock of the Arthurian cycle is not his glorious reign at Camelot, but the mystery of his departure and the promise of his return. Mortally wounded at the Battle of Camlan, Arthur is said not to have died, but to have been ferried away to the mystical Isle of Avalon to be healed of his grievous wounds. The prophecy declares that he will sleep there until the hour of Britain's greatest need, when he will awaken to lead his people once more. This narrative serves an identical function to the Merovingian Roi Perdue. It provides a nation with a mythic safety net, a cultural comfort that even in the darkest of times, their greatest champion is not gone forever, but merely in reserve, his return a constant possibility that fuels national identity and resilience. Venture east to Russia, and you find a strikingly similar, though historically much more recent, phenomenon with the mystery of the Romanovs. Following the brutal execution of Tsar Nicholas II and his family in 1918, rumors immediately began to circulate that one of his children, most famously his youngest daughter Anastasia, had miraculously survived the massacre. For decades, numerous impostors emerged, each claiming to be the lost royal heir, and each finding a willing audience among those devastated by the collapse of the old order and the horrors of the revolution. The emotional power of this story was so immense that it persisted even after the Romanovs' remains were eventually discovered and identified through DNA analysis. The desire for a surviving Tsar was not merely a monarchist fantasy. It was a longing for a tangible link to a past that had been violently erased, a symbol of continuity that could perhaps absolve the national trauma of regicide and offer a path back to a perceived former stability. This pattern repeats itself across the globe. In various Celtic traditions, there are stories of kings or heroes sleeping within hills, like the Welsh King Arthur or the Irish hero Fionn mac Cumhaill, who will awake when their people call. In Germanic lore, the Emperor Frederick Barbarossa is said not to have drowned but to sit asleep at a stone table inside the Kifjusa mountain, his red beard growing through the table, waiting for the ravens to cease circling the peak to signal his time to return and restore the Holy Roman Empire to its former glory. Even in a modern, non-monarchical context, we see echoes of this in the persistent conspiracy theories that certain fallen leaders, from Elvis Presley to John F. Kennedy, did not truly die but are waiting in seclusion. So why does this specific story have such a formidable grip on the human imagination? The answer lies in the deep psychological and societal functions these myths perform. Firstly, they are powerful coping mechanisms for dealing with catastrophic loss and unresolved trauma. The sudden, violent, or unjust end of a dynasty or a beloved leader creates a psychic wound, a narrative that feels incomplete and wrong. The idea of a hidden heir provides a sense of continuity. It denies the finality of the loss and offers the comforting possibility of reversal. It allows a people to believe that the story isn't over, that the evil or chaos that triumphed was only a temporary victory. Secondly, these myths serve as a potent form of social and political critique. The belief in a true king waiting in the wings is by its very nature a condemnation of the current ruling powers. It implies that those currently on the throne are illegitimate, corrupt, or unworthy, mere placeholders for the rightful sovereign. This was a relatively safe way for an oppressed population to express dissent and maintain hope for change without openly committing treason. The myth of the returning king embodies the ideal that just rule is not merely a matter of power, but of legitimacy, blood, and divine sanction, an ideal that can be held up to shame the shortcomings of the present. Finally, and perhaps most profoundly, these stories address a fundamental human longing for order and meaning. History is chaotic, filled with seemingly random suffering and injustice. The concept of a hidden heir, guided by fate or divine providence, reintroduces a sense of destiny and purpose into that chaos. It suggests that the turmoil of the present is not meaningless, but merely a prelude to a grand, preordained restoration. It transforms a nation's suffering into a test of faith, a necessary trial that must be endured before the Savior King can return. The Merovingian conspiracy, with its layers of secret societies, coded paintings, and ancient bloodlines, is simply this timeless archetype dressed in the intricate garb of modern historical mystery, proving that even in our age of science and reason, we are still profoundly comforted by the oldest of stories, that the true king is never truly gone and that he will return to make everything right again. If we could travel back in time and collect a DNA sample from a Merovingian king, what would modern science be able to tell us? In an era obsessed with genetic ancestry tests, it's tempting to believe that a simple cheek swab could finally settle the centuries-old debate. The reality, however, is far more complex and reveals why the mystery is so resistant to a purely scientific solution. The fundamental challenge is one of basic biology and historical record. To prove a direct, unbroken paternal lineage, scientists would need to analyze the Y chromosome, which is passed virtually unchanged from father to son. The ideal scenario would be to locate the well-preserved remains of a key figure like Dagobert II, extract a viable Y chromosome DNA signature, and then compare it to a living individual who claims descent. The problem is, the remains of the Merovingian monarchs are either lost, destroyed, or hopelessly contaminated. Dagobert's own tomb was vandalized during the French Revolution, and his bones were scattered. Other royal burial sites have been disturbed over the centuries, and even if remains are found, extracting uncontaminated ancient DNA is an immense technical challenge. Without an undisputed source of the original royal DNA, any comparison is built on a foundation of sand. Even if we miraculously obtained a clean Merovingian Y chromosome profile, the next obstacle is arguably greater, establishing a continuous, documented paternal line from the 8th century to the present day. This would require an unbroken chain of father-son relationships for over 50 generations. History, however, is messy. Family lines can be broken by adoption, by children born outside of marriage, by name changes, and by simple gaps in the historical record. Medieval chronicles are often incomplete, biased, or forged for political gain. The genealogies presented by Pierre Plantard in the dossier Secrets have been thoroughly debunked as inventive fabrications, weaving together unrelated noble families with creative license. Furthermore, the very nature of aristocracy means that bloodlines constantly intermingle. The same genetic markers that might be found in a potential Merovingian descendant could also be found in thousands of other individuals across Europe who share a common ancestor from the broader Frankish noble class, not necessarily the specific royal Theudens line. A genetic match wouldn't prove a unique claim to the throne. It would merely confirm a shared ancestry with a vast swath of the European population. Beyond these practical hurdles, broader studies of European genetics actually work against the idea of a unique, sacred bloodline. Research into the Y chromosome haploid groups of modern Europeans has beautifully illustrated the massive migration periods that shaped the continent, including the movement of Frankish tribes. These studies confirm that the Franks had a significant genetic impact, particularly on what is now France and Western Germany. However, they do not point to a single, extraordinary royal genetic signature. The Merovingians, from a genetic standpoint, were almost certainly part of this broader Frankish aristocratic elite. Their distinctiveness was a cultural, political, and mythological construction reinforced by their long hair, their origin stories, and their rituals, not a matter of unique biology that would be visible in a DNA sequence. Science suggests they were powerful chieftains from a specific genetic population, not biologically set apart as demigods or divine scions. This leads to the most intriguing point. Even if irrefutable genetic evidence emerged tomorrow that disproved any survival or special status of the Merovingian bloodline, it would likely do very little to dampen the enthusiasm of conspiracy theorists. For the true believer, the absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. It is proof of the conspiracy's success. A negative DNA result would be interpreted not as a scientific conclusion, but as the expected outcome of a centuries-long cover-up. The argument would be that the powerful institutions that supposedly obscured the truth, the church, various governments, secret societies, would have certainly tampered with evidence, planted false remains, or discredited any legitimate genetic research. This is the self-sealing nature of most conspiracy theories. They incorporate any potential rebuttal into the framework of the conspiracy itself, making them virtually unfalsifiable. The belief is not in a historical fact that can be proven or disproven, but in a grand alternative narrative about power, suppression, and hidden truth. For those invested in this narrative, a DNA test is irrelevant. The real truth, they would argue, isn't stored in a chromosome. It's protected by oath and ritual, waiting not for a scientist in a lab coat, but for a chosen initiate in a hidden chamber. The genetic evidence, or lack thereof, becomes just another layer in the mystery, a debate that science can inform but can never truly resolve because it operates on two entirely different planes of evidence and belief. Yet beneath the surface of historical debate and genetic inquiry lies a far more potent force, the timeless allure of the story itself. The enduring power of the Merovingian bloodline conspiracy, and others like it, isn't rooted in dusty archives or DNA sequences, but in the deepest recesses of the human psyche. It taps into a collection of fundamental cognitive patterns and emotional needs that render us uniquely susceptible to its charms, transforming a debunked historical hoax into a narrative that feels irresistibly true. At its core, this appeal is a story about how our minds grapple with a chaotic and complex world, seeking order and meaning in the shadows of the past. One of the most powerful psychological engines driving this belief is a cognitive bias known as apophenia, the innate human tendency to perceive meaningful patterns and connections within random data. Our brains are extraordinary pattern recognition machines. This skill is fundamental to our survival, allowing us to identify threats, predict outcomes, and make sense of our environment. However, this same strength becomes a vulnerability when applied to the ambiguous tapestry of history. We instinctively look for links for a storyline. The discovery of a B symbol in a Merovingian tomb and its later appearance in Masonic imagery feels significant. The tragic fate of the Cathars in the same region where a lost prince might have been hidden seems like more than a coincidence. Our minds, wired for narrative, seamlessly connect these dots across centuries, creating a compelling picture of a hidden hand guiding events. What a historian sees as unrelated occurrences, the pattern-seeking mind interprets as a deliberate trail of breadcrumbs left by a secret society, confirming a truth that feels intuitively obvious even in the absence of concrete evidence. This desire for patterns is deeply intertwined with a profound aversion to randomness and chaos. Human history is an immensely complicated web of countless individual actions, accidents, economic shifts, and environmental factors. The rise and fall of a dynasty like the Merovingians was the result of a multitude of intersecting causes: political maneuvering, economic pressures, military successes and failures, and plain old luck. Accepting this complexity can feel deeply unsatisfying. It suggests that the course of our world is arbitrary, subject to chance, and ultimately without a grand design. Bloodline conspiracy theories offer a powerful antidote to this unsettling idea. They replace a messy, multi-causal explanation with a clean, simple, and emotionally satisfying narrative. A single, shadowy group orchestrated everything according to a master plan. The Merovingians didn't fall because of a slow shift in administrative power. They were overthrown in a calculated coup by a church terrified of their secret. This transformation of complex history into a straightforward story of good versus evil, of a righteous hidden truth battling a corrupt institution, provides a comforting sense of order and purpose. It makes the world feel more understandable and, in a strange way, more manageable. Furthermore, these theories masterfully exploit the powerful allure of forbidden or secret knowledge, a concept known as esotericism. The idea that there is a truth known only to a select few is intellectually seductive. It creates a clear divide between the enlightened, us, who are in on the secret, and the ignorant, them, who accept the mainstream narrative. Learning about the Priory of Sion, deciphering codes in paintings, or tracing a hidden genealogy isn't just an academic exercise. It feels like an initiation into an exclusive club. This process bestows a sense of special insight and intellectual superiority upon the believer. It's far more gratifying to believe you have uncovered a truth hidden for centuries than to accept the consensus of historians. This secret knowledge becomes a form of intellectual property, a cherished insight that defines one's identity as a skeptical, free-thinking individual who cannot be fooled by the official story. The very act of digging for this hidden truth is often more rewarding than the truth itself, providing a continuous and engaging intellectual puzzle. On an emotional level, these narratives also fulfill a deep need for hope and redemption. The story of the Roi Perdu, the lost king sleeping until his nation's hour of greatest need, is a profoundly hopeful archetype. It suggests that no matter how corrupt, unjust, or chaotic the present may seem, a better, purer past can be restored. A hidden heir represents a chance for a reset, a return to a mythical golden age of justice and order. This is an incredibly potent narrative during times of social anxiety, political disillusionment, or rapid cultural change. It provides a form of mythical comfort, a promise that the current state of the world is not permanent and that a hidden force is working behind the scenes to set things right. This isn't just about history, it's about projecting our hopes for the future onto the past, creating a destiny that feels both inevitable and righteous. The Merovingian bloodline, in this sense, is less a historical fact and more a vessel for our collective longing for a world that makes sense. A story where the good guys are ultimately waiting in the wings, ready to reclaim their rightful place and restore the natural order of things. While Dan Brown's blockbuster novel and its film adaptation undoubtedly launched the Merovingian mystery into the stratosphere of public awareness, they were merely the most prominent vessels for a story that has seeped deeply into the very fabric of modern popular culture. The core ingredients of the conspiracy, an ancient secret society, a hidden bloodline, coded messages in art, and a shadow war against a powerful institution, provide a ready-made toolkit for storytellers across all media. This narrative framework is incredibly versatile, easily adapted into the structure of a thriller, a fantasy epic, or even a supernatural drama, ensuring the Merovingian legend continues to evolve and find new audiences far beyond the pages of history books. Television series, in particular, have eagerly embraced the rich tapestry of this conspiracy, using its extended timeline to weave complex multi-season arcs. The History Channel's popular show Ancient Aliens frequently segments dedicated to Rennes le Chateau and the Priory of Sion, repackaging the terrestrial mystery within its signature extraterrestrial framework and suggesting the holy bloodline itself might have otherworldly origins. More significantly, the acclaimed series The Blacklist dedicated a major portion of its second season to a storyline involving a mysterious organization called the Fulcrum, which was explicitly modeled on the Priory of Sion. The show featured a hidden lineage, a secret war for control, and a hunt for encrypted information that could topple governments, directly mirroring the beats of the Merovingian mythos. By integrating these elements into a contemporary espionage thriller, the series demonstrated how effortlessly the conspiracy could be updated to reflect modern anxieties about surveillance, deep state politics, and the fragility of recorded history. The world of video games offers an even more immersive playground for these ideas, allowing players to actively participate in the hunt for the truth. The blockbuster Assassin's Creed franchise, which revolves around a millennia-old secret war between the Templars and the Assassins, is steeped in the iconography and themes of the Bloodline Conspiracy. While focusing on the Templars, the game's lore deeply explores the concept of pieces of Eden, powerful artifacts from a pre-human civilization which functionally serve the same narrative role as the Holy Grail, a mysterious, powerful object sought by secret societies that holds the key to humanity's past. The games allow players to explore beautifully rendered historical settings like the Crusades and Renaissance Italy, interacting with figures like Leonardo da Vinci, and piecing together a hidden history that exists just beneath the surface of our own. This interactive experience transforms the player from a passive consumer into an active investigator, solidifying the appeal of the conspiracy by making them the protagonist of their own Da Vinci Code-style adventure. Beyond direct adaptations, the core themes of the Merovingian story have become ubiquitous tropes. The idea of a character discovering they are the hidden heir to a sacred lineage is a staple in fantasy, from Aragorn's rediscovery of his rightful kingship in The Lord of the Rings to the myriad of chosen one narratives in young adult fiction like Percy Jackson or The Mortal Instruments. These stories tap into the same universal appeal, the thrilling idea that an ordinary person might possess an extraordinary hidden identity and destiny. The trope of a secret society pulling the strings of world events, from the Illuminati in comics and films to the expansive conspiracies within the Metal Gear Solid series, directly descends from the template established by Tales of the Priory of Sion. This cultural permeation demonstrates that the specifics of the Merovingian history are almost secondary. It is the powerful underlying story structure that has proven to be endlessly recyclable and compelling. The reason this particular historical mystery holds such enduring creative power is its unique blend of the verifiable and the vague. There are real Merovingian kings with real, fascinating histories and intriguing archaeological finds. There is a very real village of Rennes-le-Château and a very real priest who spent a fortune of unknown origin. These tangible anchors provide a foundation of credibility that pure fiction lacks. Yet, the gaps in the record, the lost documents, the unanswered questions, the unverified rumors provide the blank canvas. Creative minds are drawn to these historical gray areas because they offer the freedom to invent and speculate while still being loosely moored to reality. This combination allows a writer to impart a sense of weight and plausibility to even the most outlandish plotlines, inviting the audience to wonder, if only for a moment, could it be true? Ultimately, popular culture does not simply spread the conspiracy theory, it metabolizes it. Each new movie, game, or television show takes the core elements and reinterprets them through a contemporary lens, reflecting current fears and fascinations. The paranoia about the church in the Da Vinci Code speaks to a modern distrust of large institutions. The cybernetic themes in shows like The Blacklist reframe the secret society as a digital age cabal controlling information. This process ensures the legend never grows stale. It is constantly being reborn and reimagined, its details blurred and reshaped to fit new narratives. The historical Merovingians have become a kind of narrative raw material, their story stripped down to its most powerful archetypes and then rebuilt for each new generation, ensuring that the long-haired kings continue their reign not in history, but in the limitless kingdom of the imagination. And so we reach the end of our journey, a winding path that has taken us from the ox carts of ancient Frankish kings to the digital forgeries of the 20th century. We've stood in the restored church at Rennes-le-Château, walked the battlefields of the Albigensian Crusade, and unraveled the intricate threads of a hoax that captivated millions. The story of the Merovingian bloodline conspiracy is a vast and intricate tapestry, woven with equal parts historical fact, romantic legend, and deliberate deception. It is a tale that speaks less about what happened in the dim past and more about our perpetual desire to find patterns and meaning in that past. What makes this mystery so uniquely enduring, even in the face of overwhelming debunking? It is not the strength of its evidence, which is paper-thin at best and demonstrably fraudulent at worst. Its power lies in its profound narrative resonance. This is a story that has everything: a tragic fall from power, a miraculous survival, hidden treasure, secret societies, famous geniuses, and a villainous institution suppressing a world-changing truth. It is a grand, unified theory of hidden history, connecting dots across 2,000 years into a single, thrilling narrative arc. In a complex and often confusing world, such a story provides a comforting simplicity, a clear battle between light and darkness, with the promise that the true heroes are merely waiting for their moment to return. This taps into a fundamental human need for enchantment. We live in an age of science and reason, where much of the world's mystery has been explained away. The Merovingian legend offers a gateway back to a time when the world felt more magical, when kings could be born of sea monsters and their hair held supernatural power. It suggests that just beneath the mundane surface of our reality lies a more epic and meaningful story, one where every famous painting might contain a coded message and every historical event might be part of a grand secret plan. This is an incredibly seductive idea, offering not just knowledge but a sense of wonder and belonging to something larger than ourselves. Ultimately, the truth of the Merovingian bloodline may be less important than the conversations it continues to spark. It forces us to question the stories we are told by authority, to look critically at the historical record, and to recognize the powerful allure of a good story well told. Whether you choose to believe in the survival of the sacred lineage or dismiss it as an elaborate modern myth, the journey of exploration is its own reward. It invites us to engage with history not as a dry list of dates and dead kings, but as a living, breathing mystery full of unanswered questions. So the next time you look at a painting by Leonardo da Vinci, or read about the Knights Templar, or even hear a story about a lost king, remember the long-haired monarchs of the Franks. Let it be a reminder that history is not always what it seems, and that the most enduring mysteries are those that live not in the archives, but in the boundless landscape of the human imagination. The search for truth is never truly